Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. The relationship between ancient Greek philosophy and rabbinic literature has long been a source of fascination for scholars and laypersons alike. Many have sought to trace intellectual and linguistic features of rabbinic literature back to the world of Hellenistic philosophy and attempt to draw parallels between the two. One intriguing element of this field is the question of form and literary features. It will not escape the notice of many Talmudists that the format of logical argumentation and contrapuntal debate in the Talmud bears more than a passing resemblance to elements of ancient philosophical discourse, most notably the immortal dialogues written by the Greek philosopher Plato in the 4th century BCE. The possibility of connections between these two remarkable areas of intellectual discourse is a tantalizing one indeed, and it is this that we shall be discussing today. Among those who have explored the connections between the Talmudic and Platonic texts is Dr. Jacob Howland, who is a professor of philosophy emeritus at the University of Tulsa and who currently serves as the Provost and Dean of the Intellectual Foundations program at the University of Austin. He has written numerous books and articles in the fields of philosophy and Judaism. Most relevant to our purposes today is his work, Plato and the Talmud, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010. It is an honor to welcome him to the podcast today. Professor Howland, great to see you.
Great to be here, JJ. It's certainly my honor to appear on your podcast.
Fantastic. Excellent. So as appalling as this might sound, some of our listeners may not be so familiar with Plato's dialogue. So to begin and to introduce the subject, could you perhaps give us a few minutes of description of the dialogues? What are they? When were they written? What do they attempt to do? And how important are they for the development of Western philosophy?
Sure. Well, the dialogues were written by Plato, who was an Athenian. He was born in roughly 428. If I recall correctly, died around 348. I might be off by a couple of years. And the dialogues were written, as you said, in the 4th century. We can be pretty certain they were written in the first half of the 4th century. Plato was a student of Socrates, and Socrates was a philosopher who, as Cicero said, brought philosophy down from the heavens, because the so-called pre-Socratics were very interested in metaphysical questions like, what is everything? Where did it come from? And so forth. And brought it into the cities of men and made it ask questions about virtue and the good life and so on and so forth. And so Socrates is the protagonist of the Platonic dialogues. He was executed in 399 BC. And rather than crawling off to a cave and, spending his life mourning his teacher and friend, he wrote 35 dialogues. Now, what are dialogues? They are philosophical dramas. And from a literary point of view, the closest relationship that I can think of would be, or the closest comparison would be the tragic, comic, and satyr play dramas that were produced by the Athenian playwrights in the 5th century. In the Platonic dialogues, there aren't murders and the sorts of actions and tragedy that we see in, say, Greek tragedy, except for the dialogue called the Phaedo, where Socrates drinks hemlock when he's executed. But what Plato does is he introduces a new kind of protagonist. So whereas Greek drama took its beginnings from Homer, and so you've got tragedies, for example, that feature Heracles or Achilles, this is a new kind of hero, a philosophical hero. Let's say a philosophical Hercules or Heracles. This is actually like the Talmud. The Talmud at one point turns Joshua into a kind of a yeshiva bacher, right, who studies Torah. Something along the same lines of a transition is occurring in the Platonic dialogues. So what do the Platonic dialogues do? Well, first of all, they rehabilitate eros, or passionate desire. If you read Thucydides, the word eros is essentially a dirty word. It shows up about 6 times in Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, and it tends to mean like a lust for glory, or a lust for wealth, or a lust for power. Plato redirects eros and says that its proper object is the transcendent truth, eternal being, right? The good, which he compares to the sun. So the dialogues focus on humanly essential truth, and they provide a new curriculum that I would say is both political as well as spiritual. And one more comparison to the Talmud is that the Platonic dialogues look back. Again, Socrates has been executed. Plato is writing about events that occurred in the 5th century. And there's a kind of fictional element. This is, let's say, a kind of historical fiction, because Socrates will be put together with people with whom he may not have spoken in life or even invented characters. But the dialogues try to recollect and recover the past, and in so doing, connect the readers to a community of inquiry. And I would argue that the Talmud does the same thing, and we can talk about that a bit more later.
Right. And I suppose an important element of Plato's dialogues, which also worthwhile mentioning at this point, is they usually have a specific object of inquiry. What is courage, or what is piety, and they go back and forth in an attempt to, I would say, to purify the concept, to try and arrive at what is the true understanding of whatever that particular idea, whatever the particular concept is. And there's this process of refining through relentless question and answer. I mean, would that be an accurate characterization of the Socratic method?
Yeah, I think that's right. So there's talk of the Socratic method. I'm not sure the word method is quite accurate because it tends to imply a kind of mechanical procedure. But essentially, what Socrates is doing is beginning conversations with his fellow Athenians, in most cases, that focus on a very practical problem. So, for example, there's a dialogue called the Laches, and there are a couple of men who run into Socrates and say, well, we're just talking about whether our son should study with this particular teacher who has a newfangled kind of weapon, right? And so that's the question at stake. But what happens is they begin to talk about courage. And so this might be related to this question of this weapon, because it could be that the weapon enhances courage or obviates the need for it or something like that. So the dialogues tend to shuttle back and forth between the particular issue at hand, the concrete issue at hand, and what you might call the purified conception, using your language, of the concept under discussion, in this case, courage. And the way that works is that Socrates asks pointed questions of his interlocutors. And what almost always happens is that the interlocutor begins to realize that he doesn't really understand what he's talking about. So claims are made. Socrates asks questions that ultimately refute the initial claim. A new claim is made. And in this way, we sort of acquire focus and breadth and depth. Although many of the Platonic dialogues, perhaps most, end without an actual understanding of the object under discussion. For example, what is the nature of courage? That's a kind of brief introduction to the Socratic method. So one of the things that happens then is that the dialogues model what it is like to undergo or undertake a philosophical investigation. And they also induce humility because you need to know that you don't know before you can undertake a quest for knowledge.
Okay, interesting. So before diving into the content, let us address a little bit the historical time frame. So the Talmud contains statements from rabbis living both in the land of Israel and Babylonia, say roughly the first 4 or 5 centuries of the Common Era. So I guess my question is, to what degree had Greek writings penetrated these lands during this period? And is your claim regarding Platonic dialogues and the Talmud essentially a historical one? Were rabbis directly influenced, as best we can see, by Plato's dialogues? Were they sitting around in Yavne or in Pumbedita, sitting around reading, Socratic dialogues? Or that's not really what you're saying, and you're essentially claiming basic similarities, but not so much a strong historical claim. Meaning, what do you think the historical connection is between the Platonic text that you're talking about and the rabbinic writings, which occur a couple centuries later in a faraway land? Do we know something about where the Greek text traveled and how far they traveled and how well they traveled during that period?
Yeah. So look, the communities of the Near East, and let's say the communities that dwell around the Mediterranean Sea, appeared to have been exchanging stories and ideas. And so there were all kinds of cross-cultural influences. In the Gilgamesh epic, there's a story of the flood, and then we find in Genesis, a story of a flood and so forth. Now, I am not an expert by any means on the influence of Greek thought on rabbinic thought, although I did have a conversation with Warren Zev Harvey at Hebrew University, and he pointed me to an article that he wrote in which he argued that the rabbis were aware of Greek philosophy, even though they don't discuss it, in the Talmud. In fact, when philosophy comes up, it sort of tends to be something that you shouldn't go study that stuff, right?
Yes, as it says in the Talmud, you can study Greek philosophy at a time which is neither day nor night, right?
Exactly, exactly. Right between, like right before sunrise and right, before sunset or something like that is sort of this liminal period. But so my argument isn't really a historical argument. It's an examination of the similarities between these two kinds of texts. And however, I can make certain historical comparisons that I think are perhaps illuminating. Both the Platonic dialogues and the Talmud are responses to historical crises. So really the crisis that the Platonic dialogues respond to is not just the death of Socrates, but the defeat of the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War, which was connected in certain ways with the execution of Socrates. And obviously, the Talmud is also a response to a major crisis, that is the destruction of the Second Temple. So, of course, you have the Second Temple. This is the locus of contact with God. You've got priests, you've got sacrifices. That's all wiped away by the destruction of the Second Temple. And the Bible becomes the locus of contact with God. And these so-called scribes, who are now called rabbis, take the place, so to speak, of the priests. And deeds of loving kindness and, good deeds substitute for the sin offering, for example. And what's very interesting, I think, about comparing these two sorts of texts as a response to crisis is that the fruitfulness of that response arises from a genuinely living and fruitful tradition. We see the resilience of the tradition, the capacity to regenerate itself. I don't have to give your listeners examples of how that works in the Jewish tradition. Like, this is the sort of great strength of the Jewish tradition. It's interesting because Plato didn't have quite as much to work with, but he did have the example of Socrates. He did have the example of the pre-Socratic philosophers. He was an Athenian, which produced, in a community with, 50,000 citizens, that is, adult Athenian males, an extraordinary number of brilliant, creative thinkers, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Thucydides, etc., etc. And it was out of that tradition somehow that he drew the resources to produce this new curriculum. So in these respects, I think the Greek tradition resembles the Jewish tradition. That's the one historical point I would make that I think is most essential.
Okay, so one of your key arguments in your book is your attempt to break down the oft-quoted dichotomy proposed by Leo Strauss and others between Athens and Jerusalem, or between reason and faith, right? This idea that on the one hand you have the Athenian tradition, which is all about philosophy and the employment of reason to try and find truth, and Jerusalem, which is emblematic of the Judaic and later the Christian religion, which is all about faith, accepting things, accepting ideas through tradition, and not necessarily investigating it from your own reason. So it seems that your argument is that this dichotomy ought to be destabilized and at least complicated to a fair degree. That Jerusalem contains actually a fair amount of reason, and that Athens contains a fair amount of faith. Is this correct? Can you elaborate upon this point, which is central to your work?
Yeah. So first of all, the paradigm. So Athens is associated with unaided reason finding its way to the truth on its own. So your listeners will be familiar with Plato's cave image. The notion is that we get out of the cave through the exercise of our intelligence by ourselves. Now, looking at the cave image, there's another possibility that's implicit in that image, and that is that we can't get out of the caves under our own steam exclusively. The truth must come to us. That is to say, goodness and truth must somehow enter into the cave of human life. And that would be the alternative of revelation. And so Jerusalem is associated with revelation. Now, another element of this is that Leo Strauss says, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in the Bible. That is to say, you begin from faith, you begin from the acceptance of the authority of God, you begin from this historical revelation at Sinai, and so forth. Whereas love of wisdom is the beginning in the context of Athens. Okay, so how am I complicating this picture? Well, first of all, in my study of Plato, it struck me at some point that philosophy begins in faith in a very specific sense. So in the dialogue called the Apology, Socrates, and he's on trial, and he's trying to explain to the Athenians why he philosophizes and how he began to philosophize and so forth. And he says, a friend of mine went to the oracle at Delphi, which was a major sort of locus of contact with the gods in the Greek world. And the oracle would answer questions. So his friend went and said, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle said, no. Okay. Now, it turns out that this no turns out to be, in my perspective, sort of the shortest religious revelation in history. Because what Socrates then does is, without argument, incidentally, he says, I've got to take this seriously. If I had walked up to Socrates and said, there's no one wiser than you, he might have ignored me. Who am I? I'm just some guy who approaches him on the street. But this is the God. And he presupposes that this is a divine utterance of some sort. So he begins to ask himself two questions. How is it that I'm wise? I'm not aware that I'm wise, number one. And number two, embedded in that question is really the question, who is Socrates, right? Because if it turns out that he is wise, then he has to acquire some kind of self-understanding to grasp that point. And it's that leads him to go around the city and ask people questions. And he discovers that actually people don't know what they're talking about. And this is the beginning of his philosophical quest. So my claim is that Socratic philosophizing originates in this contact with the oracle at Delphi. Now, in addition, let's go to the rabbis. There's a wonderful book by Menachem Fish called Rational Rabbis. And incredibly, the first sort of 40 pages of the book is about Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, who laid out sort of a theory of scientific investigation in the 20th century, in which he pointed out that certain kinds of scientific knowledge, like let's say knowledge of gravity, right? There's this law of gravity that masses attract each other. It can't be proved because we don't have access to all mass in the universe that we could observe and watch the relationships between. But it can be falsified. That is, we can conduct tests. So I can pick up a pencil, I can let it go, and if the pencil falls toward the earth, the theory of gravity has not been falsified. Okay? And what he claims is that the rabbis are effectively engaged in a kind of Popperian investigation of their received wisdom. So they will set up questions and interrogate them and see if they can falsify, let's say, the teachings of an earlier rabbi or the teachings of the tradition. But in addition, I would say one of the claims I have to make about Athens and Jerusalem, if we sort of explore the embeddedness of Jerusalem and Athens and vice versa, is that Socrates actually resembles something like a Hebrew prophet. You see, the Greeks didn't really know what to do with him. A prophet in the Greek context is somebody who can predict the future. That's not what Socrates is doing. As he says in the Apology, and as he does in the dialogues, he goes around and tries to convince people that their souls are the most important thing in their life, more important than wealth, more important than health, and that they should in particular have a concern for justice. And I could develop that point, but there are certain connections between the way that Socrates is portrayed, his hesitancy to undertake an investigation of what the Delphic Oracle means, the reassurance of his daimonion, his divine voice, and so forth, that sort of map onto the Hebrew prophets. And one other thing I'd say that connects Athens and Jerusalem is that the Talmud and the dialogues privilege questions, the asking of questions. You know, I recall Elie Wiesel in his book Night, when he's talking about Moshe the beetle, Moshe teaches him that we raise ourselves to God by the questions we ask. And that can be mapped directly onto philosophy. So those are points of contact, I think, that connect Athens and Jerusalem in ways that I don't think the Straussian dichotomy does justice to.
This is interesting, I think, because what comes out of what you're saying is that if Socrates' entire philosophical project stemmed from, as you say, let's say, an act of revelation or a message from the gods, as it were, what comes out from this is that philosophical investigations in general and all worldviews of that kind do presuppose certain axioms. There's certain principles that you just take as read in order to proceed with any kind of intellectual inquiry at all. In which case, would it not follow that the difference between Athens and Jerusalem being sort of the faith-based civilization, the distance between them is one of degree and not one of kind? In other words, that even Athens, at its very core, at the very foundational moment of its the beginning of its philosophical journey, must rely on a principle that cannot be gotten from its philosophy because the philosophy is dependent upon that principle.
That's correct. Aristotle and Plato, and let me say, I think Aristotle formulates very clearly much of what is implicit in the Platonic dialogues. And Aristotle has this notion that he articulates in the 6th book of the Nicomachean Ethics of intuition. That is, there's a kind of direct intellectual perception of the nature of being. Okay, that would be sort of the unargued axiomatic beginning. That's where we begin from. Philosophers have attempted to eliminate that beginning, and the most famous or perhaps infamous attempt is Hegel, who claims that he's going to start from no presuppositions whatsoever. So in his logic, he starts from being, just the sheer being of the world, right? And then he tries to sort of deduce everything, essentially, in a kind of circle, right? So that we can get all of philosophy without making any presuppositions, except for this notion of being. That, however, isn't philosophy anymore. What Hegel was trying to do was not to be a lover of wisdom, merely a philosophos, Sophia being wisdom, but a wise man. Famously, that didn't quite succeed. One of the way to put this, by the way, is that whereas in the Platonic dialogues, you ask questions and you refine your positions, and we don't ever reach an ultimate understanding. In Hegel, that dialectic is, that's what's called, with this sort of question and answer thing, supposedly reaches a final point. But let me say one other thing, though. There is a difference I would like to point out that isn't a difference of degree. Okay. So let's say that our beginning was that there is a God who cares for us. All right. You cannot deduce the person of that God or God's love or care for us, human beings, without some indication on the part of the God. Right? In other words, suppose I said to you, JJ, look, there's somebody out there and this person loves you. You couldn't deduce the existence of that person or that person's love for you unless that person did something to announce his or her presence. You see what I'm saying? So I think that's a difference of kind. Now, Socrates, however, does begin with the notion that there are these divine beings. We'll come back to that in a bit, but I definitely accept your point in the way that you articulated it. I think that's right.
Okay, there's so much I want to get to, so I want to move on from this. Another element that you wrote about, which I suppose is a similarity between the Talmud and the Platonic dialogues, is that both of them combine the vita activa and the vita contemplativa, right? The sort of the intellectual life and the active life, and that the principle, I suppose, that intellectual discussions aren't merely an end in themselves, but rather surround a certain life form, a certain way of acting in the world, and therefore, all our brain power and all our discussions are for the sake of dedicating our actions towards a certain purpose. Does that apply equally, let's say, to the Platonic dialogues and the Talmud? Are there similarities on that score? How do you characterize the relationship between the two in this particular regard?
Yeah, I think in both the dialogues and in the Talmud, the point of inquiry is not simply to arrive at a theoretical understanding, but to exemplify, to take the humanly essential truth that one has grasped into one's soul and to exemplify it in a life, in speeches and deeds. And indeed, this is crucial to our understanding of Talmudic Agadah, right? Storytelling about the rabbis in particular, and the Platonic dialogues, because what we are given is a broad, in both cases, a sort of broad range of exemplary individuals and lives. And incidentally, the reader has the authority and indeed perhaps the obligation to sort through these examples and decide which ones are going to be most determinative of his or her life, right? That is, we see the rabbis arguing, right? There are hundreds of rabbis in the Talmud, and they argue about, what should we do about the poor, right? And things like this. So, and they have different positions. Now, that's a stimulus to sort of saying to the reader, you should care about poverty. And you should approach it. You should attempt to mend the world in this respect, right? But how should one do that? Now that's left up to the reader. So the same thing happens in the dialogues. One example I can give you of this connection is that, as in the Talmud, like contemplation, theory, right? Theoria in the Greek sense, which doesn't mean constructing some kind of model that will explain the economy or something, but rather opening the soul to what is contemplation. That's exemplified, for example, in Plato's Symposium, when Alcibiades tells of Socrates, who, by the way, was a distinguished warrior, right? Not just a philosopher, a thinker. He tells of him on campaign that he spent one entire night thinking. He just stood there, and the various troops from around, the Greek cities gathered outside just to watch this guy. But so that episode of contemplation occurs during a war. And again, in the rabbinic context, study is itself a mitzvah. I mean, I think Steinsaltz might go a little too far when he says the whole point of the Talmud is like to know the truth. Yeah, we have to add that it's also to live the truth. They embody the ethos of Judaism, what one thinker has called the halakhic conscience, and another, the value concepts of the rabbinic life. But, one other thing I want to say, incidentally, about this is that the activity of the sages or the rabbis in, for example, the rabbinical academies, this is also constitutive of a community. It's extremely important. So there's the famous story of the oven of Achnai in Bava Metzia, and the one rabbi who a voice from heaven declares is always right on matters of halacha is kicked out. And he is kicked out because otherwise the opinions of the rest of the sages are immaterial. If you've got Rabbi Eliezer, you don't need anybody else. And they actually sort of found this rabbinical community by expelling Rabbi Eliezer with bad consequences, incidentally, because that's a difficult thing to do. So that act of argumentation and debate is actually politically significant in much the way that I would say Aristotle's account of politics is, where he explains that politics is sharing speeches in which we articulate the advantage and disadvantage, what is advantageous and disadvantageous, and what is just and unjust. And we share through logos, through speech. That kind of potentiates our capability as citizens and binds people together in a community. So that's a practical purpose of even theoretical investigation.
So I suppose you could say that neither the Talmudic rabbi nor the Athenian philosopher could do his work in a vacuum. They couldn't be a brain in a vat.
That's exactly right.
Whereas, some other philosophers, would claim, no, that's precisely the goal of philosophy, is to withdraw, is to be as theoretical as possible, is to ignore the sort of swirling and grubby political life or life of the community, and in fact arrive at truths through the most pure intellectual journey as possible. Whereas you're saying in neither of these two worlds is that a desired outcome.
That's exactly right. And the philosopher you describe who withdraws, the paradigmatic example of that is Descartes. So in the Discourse on Method, Descartes basically says, look, and this is obviously a gross sort of summary, but I'm pretty much the smartest guy around. I went to the best schools in Europe. Everything I learned was garbage, right? So we have to utterly refound philosophy. And the way to do that is to withdraw yourself from the community. He talks about sitting in a heated room, and just thinking by himself, right? So to abstract yourself from community. And that's really a kind of characteristic of modernity too, by the way, because the moderns, as you know very well, reject these old authoritative texts and old authoritative traditions, not least the Bible, right? I mean, Spinoza deconstructs the Bible. And we've got critical biblical studies, right? And it was written by human beings, etc. And then we've got Copernicus. It turns out that the Earth revolves around the sun, and so we can get rid of those ancient philosophers and the ancient biblical tradition. And so those things lose authority, and there's a deliberate attempt to cut ourselves off from the past and refound. That's a modern gesture. I think we need to recover the wisdom of the ancients in this respect.
Right, interesting. Now we've been stalling, over half an hour. Let's jump into the heart of the matter, which is, brass tacks in terms of similarities in terms of how stories are told or how debates are conducted within these two within the Talmud and Platonic dialogue. So, what are the similarities that you detected? What are the literary devices? What are the modes of discussion, let's say, principally that you have deduced there? Can you perhaps give one or two examples? And then I want to ask you, after that, is one of the places you've applied it, one of the most famous stories that you've applied this sort of Platonic-esque reading to the Talmud, is the famous story in Ta'anit of Choni HaMa'agel, or Choni the circle maker, and it sort of demands rain and draws it down from the heavens. So I suppose both of those questions at once. What are the ways in which you read the Talmud in light of Platonic dialogues, and specifically with this story, how does it come into fruition?
Yeah, so look, there are these literary similarities. The Talmud is a kind of wonderful, almost fanciful dialogue, sometimes bringing together sages who lived centuries apart and so forth. That features multiple models of lives well lived, and the Talmud contains, folk tales and midrash, or interpretation of text, legal codes, right? Theological speculation, science, and so forth. Same thing in the Platonic dialogues. Now, it's interesting because both of these texts recognize the limits of their understanding. So, for example, one of the things is that Socrates in the dialogues frequently speaks about God and sometimes the gods. And I think that's because he doesn't know whether the divine beings are singular or plural, right? Like, are there many or are there one? He doesn't, for example, name the god at Delphi because he doesn't know. And the Talmud also is constantly bumping up against these kinds of borders of understanding. So, for example, in Ta'anit 3, which I focus on in my book, there's a sort of live question, which is, how can we tell when something is a blessing or a curse? So they both kind of have this understanding of the limits of their own knowledge. Now, the Choni HaMa'agel story illustrates this, I think, very well. So the story is that there's this guy named Choni, and there's a drought, and the rabbis pray, but they can't, actually this is sort of, I think, pre-rabbinical, because Shimon is the head of the Sanhedrin. But in any case, we sort of have the beginnings of this rabbinic tradition. And so these authorities who base their powers and their understandings on their study of scripture and their study of the tradition are unable to make the rain stop, or sorry, unable to bring the rains. But Choni has a special relationship with God, and he calls on God to bring the rains, and they come. And Shimon criticizes him because Choni doesn't behave in the way that it's understood one ought to behave in relationship to God. Shimon compares him to a spoiled child, but he accepts this guy's relationship. The rabbis are very suspicious of miracles. They don't particularly like miracles because if there are miracles, one implication is that God didn't set up the world the right way at the beginning, right? So it's almost kind of implicit critique of God. But there are these miracle workers, and they accept that. And so here's a case where you have an authority, the head of the Sanhedrin, who basically says, "I don't really know what's going on, but we're going to accept the results." Another example I think I would make is that of what you might call a Jewish Socrates in the Talmud. I talk about it in my book. There's a guy named Rabbi Elazar who's very proud of himself. And he's riding along on an ass, and he runs into an extremely ugly man. And he says to the guy, "Wow, you're incredibly ugly. Is everybody from your town that ugly?" And the man says, "I don't know. Why don't you go ask my creator?" Which is great, right? It's a question. And Elazar realizes, I am an ass. I have made this presumption, of course. And so then he absorbs this lesson, and he actually teaches that one should be humble.
Sorry, if I might interrupt just for a moment. I think that's a very interesting parallel into the Socratic world, precisely because there were those who consider themselves literally the sophists, the sophisticated ones, who were running around in the time of Socrates, who imagine themselves the possessors of these truths. And Socrates presents himself as sort of this earthy, or let's say more grounded individual who deflates their high-minded ideas and prepackaged truths by simple, easy questioning. And so I suppose Rabbi meeting this ugly man would precisely deflate his high-minded ideas with a simple but very pointed and direct question. I guess that does have the spirit of bringing down those who imagine themselves to be wise.
Exactly. And as you know, JJ, the Talmud worries a lot about the way that elites, in this case, members of the Rabbinical Academy, can begin to puff themselves up and think too much of themselves and compete for position and power. I think the Oven of Achnai is an example of this. And they demand respect. I mean, there's a sense in which elites are always subject to the same kind of vices, right? But let's talk a little bit more about the story of Choni, if you like.
Please.
Choni claims to have and does have special access to God outside the rabbinic structure. And as I said, the rabbis are rational, right? They're like, we're going to study the Torah, we're going to reflect on the rabbinic tradition, we're going to, and those who have the best understanding of it will have the best grounds for proceeding and deciding questions and so on and so forth. But here comes Choni, and he even claims to be a son of your house, as he says to God, right? Like, God is sort of my father, right? And I have a special relationship to him. And when he prays for rain, he prays outside the temple. He prays privately. And as I said, Shimon said, I would have banned you if you hadn't been Choni, which basically means I would have banned you if, in fact, you hadn't succeeded in bringing the rain. But he does bring the rain. And he does so in a very kind of provocative way. I mean, when he asks for rain, first it pours down in huge drops. I forget, it says as big as a grapefruit or something like that, and then Choni says, I didn't ask for that. I asked for reasonable amount of rain. So then it comes down in like tiny little drops. He said, it's like a Goldilocks story, right? I didn't ask for this tiny amount. I asked for a medium amount of rain. And so then God brings the rain. And Choni himself regards his disciples and the people as children. And indeed, they're portrayed as a kind of fearful group, right? Because what happens, by the way, is it rains too much. And then Choni has to call for God to stop the rain. And so the problem with Choni, from the point of view of Shimon ben Shetach, who is the representative of the rabbinic tradition here, is the source of his powers. This doesn't fit the rabbinic paradigm. There are rabbis, there are sages who can work miracles, but the source of their power is their learning, right? Is their study. And so what's really interesting here is that although Shimon accepts him, that story is in the Mishnah, by the way, the Gemara gets its revenge on Choni. And this is very interesting. Choni draws a circle around himself. That's where he gets his name. And he says, I'm going to stand in this circle until God brings the rain. I'm not going anywhere. But the circle in the Gemara turns into a sign of his isolation. So, for example, it goes on and tells a story about him. And Choni runs into a man who's planting a carob tree. And he says to this guy, Why are you planting a carob tree? That tree is not going to yield fruit. And by the way, carob was a major source of nutrition in the impoverished world of the Jewish communities, particularly in what was then called Palestine after they were ejected. But in any case, he says, "Why are you planting this tree?" And the guy says, "Well, my grandchildren will be able to harvest the fruit." So already we have an indication that Honi doesn't like see himself as part of this human community. He then falls asleep for 70 years and he wakes up and he wanders over to the rabbinical academy. He says, "I'm Honi." And they're like, "No, you're not. We don't even recognize you." And he says, "Is my son still alive?" And they're like, "No, your son's dead, but your grandson is alive." So he slept for 70 years. The rabbis don't recognize him. He's lost his son. He's lost his place in the academy, and they don't even recognize him. So it's a way of sort of saying something like this. This guy, Honi, had special powers, but pedagogically speaking, he's irrelevant. He had an inimitable and unrepeatable and special relationship with God. We grant that. But he doesn't really have any place in this ongoing tradition and community of the rabbis. So I think that's actually a really interesting story. There's some question, there's a lot of question in Platonic dialogues about whether Socrates, to what extent can Socrates be imitated? But I'll just sort of leave that at there.
Right. And I suppose the message that you're saying that is to be drawn from this is the privileging of rational discussion and inquiry within the rabbinic circle over one-time charismatic leaders whose influence might be important in the moment, but not enduring.
That's exactly right. And I think charismatic is exactly right. Honi was understood to be a chassid in the ancient sense. And there are some scholars who argue that, the figure of Jesus, for example, who goes around and performs miracles, is also this kind of pietistic miracle worker, right? But what the rabbis are interested in is again, this activity isn't simply spiritual. It is political. It is building a community. It is sustaining a community. It is teaching members of that community how to be good citizens, so to speak, within the academy, and not just within the academy, because the rabbis also were leaders of the community. That's a difference, by the way, between the philosophers in the philosophical example and the Platonic academy, right? Because it's not as if the Athenians went and said, "Well, we have some major questions in our community. Let's go ask the philosophers." No, but they did ask the rabbis.
Yes, interesting. I suppose a parallel in the Platonic world could be the dialogue with Euthyphro, which you've written about as well in your book. And essentially Euthyphro being, I suppose, a high priest of some kind, some sort of venerated religious figure. But it turns out that under repeated questioning by Socrates, he actually cannot provide a satisfactory definition of what piety is, what the thing is that is desired by the gods. And I mean, would you say that also reflects a kind of Platonic hostility towards the religious leader who abandons or who doesn't pay sufficient attention to modes of rational inquiry and simply depends on this aura of spiritual excellence, as Honi did, and as Euthyphro did, and by Socrates slowly again pricking the balloon and letting the air out and deflating unwarranted presuppositions. It was shown to be a mode of ideas that can't endure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Now, Euthyphro, by the way, it's not clear to me that he was any kind of religious leader. He was really a kind of oddball. And honestly, the entire story in the Euthyphro is that of a young man who wants to take advantage of the Greek tradition to attack his father. And so, Euthyphro says, as you know, well, Zeus attacked his father and Kronos, Zeus's father, attacked his father. Why can't I attack my father? So he's sort of cutting against the grain. But I will say this, Socrates is in that dialogue trying to rehabilitate the gods, because I was just referring to myths that present the gods as really unsavory characters. It all goes back to Hesiod. So Hesiod teaches that first was chaos and everything came out of chaos. And the way I would put it is, you can take the gods out of chaos, but you can't take chaos out of the gods. And Socrates says, in effect, these stories about Zeus, and Kronos castrates his father Uranos, and then Zeus fights against and imprisons his father. These are not good stories. They present the gods as rather unadmirable and vicious beings. Therefore, they're not really worthy of worship. So let's understand the gods to be beings that, and then he sort of, you might say, characterizes them almost as if they were philosophers. Gods that love truth and reward behavior in accordance with the eternal standards of morality and so forth, right? So yes, Socrates is definitely taking on that view, and he's also taking on the one-off prophet, right? Because Again, the Greek prophet knows the future. Euthyphro claims to be a prophet. But the prophet can't say anything about the basis of that. I mean, even if there were a prophet who could determine what the future is, this is not something one can learn from, right? And if you base your political community, by the way, on those kinds of prophets, and let me say, by the way, that Greek prophets were very important. I mean, they would cut open animals before a battle or before the assembly. And if the organs didn't look right, they'd say, we can't have the fight and so on. We can't have the battle. We can't hold the assembly. If you base your community on that, you really have removed agency from human beings. Or let's put it this way. If there's a situation where you need the guidance of a prophet, but you don't actually have an effective one, then you're doomed. So I think the rabbis understand that. Let's educate everybody, right? Let's give them the tools they need to make good decisions and good judgment. And of course, we'll base that on Torah. And that's a much preferable way than going around and finding charismatic individuals who can solve problems.
Which is interesting because you do have this, in rabbinic writings, this kind of democratic impulse of spreading Torah as much as possible. Every father has to teach his son Torah, and Torah is the greatest mitzvah, etc. One doesn't get the sense, at least in much of the literature of ancient Athens, that philosophy was something that was supposed to be disseminated among the masses, or even could be. Was that this is something that even the majority of people could, even in theory, be expected to master? I mean, is that not a very significant difference?
I think it is. And look, so here we have Socrates. Socrates really tests the limits. I mean, he famously goes into the agora, into the marketplace, asks people questions. Why was Socrates executed? Well, I mean, there, by the way, is a political question. Socrates not only wanted to be an excellent citizen, and part of that was being an exemplary warrior. So in the Apology, he explains that he both offended the democracy, that is democratic Athens, and offended the so-called 30 tyrants, the oligarchy that replaced the democracy at the end of the Peloponnesian War, because he was following his own understanding of what justice is. So when he saw certain events that were just beyond the bounds of justice, he stood in opposition to both the democracy and the tyranny. That's one of the reasons he was executed by the returning Democrats. But another reason is he just angered all the Athenians, because what he would do is, and he explains this in the Apology, he would come up to a politician, let's say, in the marketplace and say, "You're a politician. You must know what justice is." "Well, of course. Tell me what it is." Here's the claim. Then Socrates takes it apart. Then he takes apart the next claim. Then the guy becomes ashamed. Meanwhile, he's surrounded by the young people. The young people love to see this stuff. So after testing these limits, Socrates is executed. So what does Plato decide to do? And by the way, Socrates had never written anything. This is also a kind of connection with the Jewish tradition, right? Because all these, the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Torah, it was all unwritten initially, and then it was written down. Plato decides, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to write dialogues that feature Socrates so we can preserve his example. And I'm going to move into this part of Athens, the groves of Academus, and found what we now call the Academy. But that's a deliberate separation. And so these actions themselves, or this action of Plato in response to the death of Socrates, poses in the starkest way the question of the relationship between philosophy and politics. And that relationship is by no means as vexed in the Jewish tradition, if by philosophy we mean rabbinic inquiry, right? Or sort of reflecting on ultimate questions. That's by no means as vexed as it is in the Platonic context, or let's say even today with regard to philosophy. So I think it is a big difference.
Interesting. I mean, we've had a whale of a time discussing the similarities, but there are a few very important differences between the two worlds, and I'd like to focus on one or two more. The main one, I think, the main difference that really slaps anyone in the face who's reading these two is just how broad the parameters of Socrates' inquiry is. I mean, you mentioned, okay, it's founded upon this kind of very laconic revelation by the gods about Socrates' wisdom, but essentially Socrates, especially because seems to be much more interested in posing questions than actually providing answers, his range of inquiry is extremely broad. He's willing to entertain almost any idea. He's willing to go wherever the evidence seems to be pointing, etc., and sort of slaughter any sacred cow. Whereas, of course, in the rabbinic tradition, you have, at least, I'd say, on the religious front, a set of principles, a set of beliefs that are very, very much fixed, that they cannot really be questioned, or at least questioned very much or very well, and therefore everything is done on a different plane. I mean, there seems to be a much more of a prefabricated set of ideas, a framework within which they must operate. I mean, is this not quite a significant difference, that Socrates will go anywhere with his questions, whereas the rabbis have to stay in quite a well-defined place.
Yes, there is a big difference there. So let's start with philosophy. So there was a sophist named Gorgias, and Gorgias wrote a book called On Nature. And here were the three theses of the book. 1, there is nothing. 2, even if there were something, it could not be known. 3, even if it could be known, it could not be communicated. Now, philosophy has its own presuppositions, and they are the antithesis of each of those three. There is something. 2, that something can be known in part and in principle by those who inquire into it. 3, that knowledge can be communicated. Okay, so those again are axiomatic. Like in other words, as you were saying earlier in the podcast, we have these axioms. So those are philosophical axioms. The rabbinic tradition, of course, goes much further because we've got Torah. So the philosophizing, if I may use that term, the rational inquiry, the investigation takes place within the horizons of Torah in the expanded sense as well as the narrow sense, right? The accumulated tradition. That's right. On the other hand, what really strikes me about the Talmud is the way in which the rabbis are ready to absolutely take off from a very particular question to stratospheric reflection on the highest and most ultimate matters. I mean, you're right. Most of the Talmud is like, okay, I have a garden. My neighbor has a garden. There's a tomato plant. The tomato plant leans over the part of the garden that is my neighbor's. Is it my neighbor's tomato? Whatever. But what's amazing is, and incidentally, I don't recall, that particular discussion, but how, 100 words later, they're like, so what was God thinking when he created the universe? Stuff like this. So there's this kind of, and there's a kind of playfulness in the best sense, a kind of intellectual playfulness. And also, by the way, a playfulness on the part of God. I mean, in the Oven of Achnai story, which is fantastic, as you know, a voice from heaven says, why are you bothering Rabbi Eliezer? This guy is always correct in matters of halacha. And incidentally, the response is, you stay out of it. Then it's reported that Elijah talked to God and God said, my sons have overcome me. And he's laughing. It's like a joke. So, you're right. There is obviously this major emphasis on law. And this is, of course, fundamental to the Jewish tradition. The law has been revealed. One of the interesting things this raises, incidentally, is a political question. Can there be a healthy republic in the absence of divinely revealed law, or in the absence of law that is considered to have a divine status? I put it that way because Plato wrote a dialogue called The Laws, in which law has exactly that status. So yes, I agree with you. That is a fundamental difference.
That is certainly an important fundamental difference. And I suppose another one is the mode in which these discussions are communicated, because one cannot help noticing that with the Socratic world, everything's very head on. Socrates is not. I mean, he is playful and he is funny and he does have this sort of a kind of a literary charm and whatnot. At least this is how Plato's describing him. I mean, this is decades after his death, but he asks things very abruptly and directly, and seems to go in a direction without deviating too much. As we're trying to get to a definition. Okay, this one doesn't work. Let's try another one. Okay, fine. That doesn't work. Let's try another one. Let's try another one. Let's try another one. The Talmud is much more oblique and communicates much more in terms of, it tells stories. As you say, what can we deduce theologically from the story of the Tanur Shel Achnai, the Oven of Achnai? The answer is, well, we're not 100% sure because it's a story. And there isn't a nimshal, isn't, the key to the analogy isn't given directly. It's just, this is the story. And we, as learners of the story, have to deduce, okay, so then what did God think of arguments? And what are we to think of the difference between divine law and human interpretations of the law? And these things are much more given over to us, whereas the Socratic or Platonic dialogue seem to me, at least, to be far more in the reader's face, unless you tell me that there are, and maybe this is the argument, you can break that either by saying, no, the Talmud is more direct than you think, or by saying that, no, Platonic dialogues are more literary and subtle and multifaceted in a literary way, more so than you would think. I mean,
yeah,
where on this spectrum would you fall?
I would fall on the side of the spectrum that you just articulated at the end there. So the fact is that You're right. There is. And if you take, for example, the Euthyphro as your paradigmatic dialogue, there's this kind of almost machine-like quality. Okay, let's keep going. Let's keep going, right? Let's keep asking questions. You haven't answered the question. Then finally, Euthyphro looks at his watch and says, oh my gosh, look at the time. I have to go now. But the fact is that the dialogues like the Talmud are full of myths and stories and playful interpretations. Think of the Phaedrus. Now, the Phaedrus is very interesting. I'll just give one example. There's a little story that Socrates comes up with, and it's a story about a pharaoh in Egypt and a god. And by the way, of course, the pharaoh is like a living god, right? So there's sort of two gods talking to each other. And one of them comes up with the idea that I've got this new device, and it's called writing. And this is going to be an aid to memory. And the other guy says, actually, it will produce a bad kind of forgetfulness, because what it will do is it will sort of serve as a device for us to recall stuff that we might have, quote, forgotten. But the real point of memory is to internalize into your soul the meaning of what it is that you've been understanding. And people won't do that if they simply rely on these mnemonic devices like writing. In the Republic, it ends famously with the myth of In the Meno, there is a myth as well. I mean, there are myths all over the place, and they're actually, let's say, that's like the difference between halakhic argumentation and agadic material in the Talmud sort of maps onto the, strictly speaking, dialogical argumentation about ideas in the dialogues and the myths and stuff. And the myths are really important. In any case, the reader is required to follow the logical argument part of the dialogues very carefully and decide, by the way, is Socrates pulling a fast one here, which he often does, right? Or, do these arguments hold water and so forth? And then also to decide on the myth. So there is this priority on interpretation. It's one of the wonderful things about the Jewish tradition. Ben Bogbog says, turn it and turn it, for everything is in it, talking of the Torah. What that does is it forces, it's not literally the case that everything is in the Torah. It forces the Jewish people to develop skills of interpretation, which in my view is the fundamental intellectual ability, interpreting evidence, right? And the same thing I think is true of the dialogues. You've got to come to your own conclusions. So yeah, I don't know where we're going with that, but I'll stop there.
No, that's a fair point. That's a good rebuttal to the point that I was making, in the sense that, no, the dialogues do have myths, and more than that, they're not, even though Socrates' manner of questioning is often very frontal and very abrupt, but nonetheless, the conversation as a whole does draw the reader in and does invite them to be a participant in this kind of point-counterpoint conversation, in which eventually the truth or a better understanding of what might be the truth comes into fruition. The final question I wanted to pose, because we're running out of time, is what's next on this particular horizon. That was so you've written this book, Plato and the Talmud, in which you take a set. I mean, there are obviously many chapters of the book, but the main elements are that you take certain stories, famous stories or narratives in the Talmud, and read them in the light of this kind of Platonic ethos. And so I suppose, I don't imagine you'll write a sequel, but if someone somewhere wants to write a sequel, if there were more avenues of inquiry within this field, what would they be? Where should they go? What are the next parts to be discovered in this relationship between these two corpora of text?
Yeah, so look, there's been a lot of good work done in the last few decades on the Jewish political tradition and the Hebrew Republic. I think there's more work to be done here. So Plato wrote a dialogue called The Laws. And again, this very question I raised earlier about whether a republic or a democratic republic can be sustained in the absence of divinely revealed law, or law that has the status of a divine revelation, that's an open question. And somebody might wish to look at Plato's Laws in relation to the Talmudic discussions of these kinds of things. I'm a big proponent of using the tradition to shed light on contemporary issues. I would say that today, the very conception of truth is under attack in some quarters. And I think that we can, as our discussion, I hope, illustrates, we can see that the dialogues in the Talmud illuminate the political and spiritual importance of the quest for truth, and also the social conditions and personal virtues that are needed for this quest. And so that material, I think, can be used to illuminate our current situation. I think there's a lot more to be learned from Talmudic Agadah, and I think anyone who reads the Agadah with the Platonic dialogues in mind will find all kinds of fruitful comparisons across a broad range of questions, including the nature of piety, the limits of knowledge, the character of political virtues, and so forth. One other area I would point out, I actually wrote an article in a Festschrift for Rana Berger on the oven of Achnai, and Aristotle played a fairly large role there. So just going back to the oven of Achnai, they excommunicate this sage Eliezer, who has a sort of direct, like he is the top guy and everything he says about halakha is correct. I compare that to Aristotle's remark in the Politics, where he says, if you've got a person who's exemplary and exceeds everyone else in virtue, you've either got to make him the king or you've got to ostracize him. Because, and in either case, you destroy the republic. You destroy the Aristotelian notion of the citizen who rules, who is ruled, learns how to rule, and rules in turn, right? And where everyone has a voice. And so I think my guess is that one could fruitfully put Aristotle alongside the dimensions of the Talmud that have this political relevance and mine a lot of more interesting things there. But I think it's a great question. I appreciate it.
Thank you. That is definitely provides a lot of food for thought. Okay, I think we must end it here. Professor Howland, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. This has been a splendid conversation, and I hope to continue the conversation in other forums at other times.
Wonderful, JJ. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Elisha Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Elisha Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.